I want to welcome everybody to this episode of LTADchat Live here on Zoom. My name is Joe Eisman. I'll be moderating today's session. For those loyal followers and learners of LTADchat, thanks for joining us again. For newcomers, welcome. Just a reminder that this is being recorded, so please mute yourself. Mind your manners on the camera. It's fine to stop your video. This is also an interactive forum, so please use the chat box for questions and interactions amongst the group. Today we're going to do a solo act instead of a panel discussion like we have been doing in some of the past LTAD chats. And as an FYI, don't miss our LTAD shorts, which we kind of just started as well, where scholars and practitioners discuss a single concept using a slide or two. And remember that all the LTAD chat lives and shorts can be found on the LTAD YouTube channel. But back to our guest. I'm happy to introduce my friend and my colleague, James Baker. And James is going to share with us his model of long-term athlete development, which he's been developing over the past several years. I believe starting off in the private sector with Ed Archer. And then also really ramping stuff up as a physical educator and strength and conditioning coach at St. Peter's School in the UK. And now he's at the incredible Aspire Academy in Qatar. Now, one thing I want to share is that something that impresses me about practitioners like James is his quest to learn and understand the science of growth and maturation and sports science, and then integrate it into his practice. And furthermore, to be reflective on his practice as well and make observations and then either challenge the existing science or really open up new questions. So I've asked James to give kind of a TED talk, an overview of his model, so about 20 minutes or so. And then we're going to use the remaining time for an open shared conversation and question and answer period. So again, please use the chat box to queue up any questions that you may have during the presentation, or just jot them down so you can ask them at the end of the talk. James, my friend, thanks for being on LTAD chat and sharing this model with us.
No problem. Appreciate the invite, Rick and Joe, to come and share and talk to people. So yeah, we'll go for a 20-minute whistle-stop tour. Some of it I'll probably go through quite quickly. And then we can go back over any bits that people have more questions on or other areas that crop up. So I'll just try and get my screen share working. Been chopping and changing my slides right up to the last minute as usual. So hopefully I've got them in the right order in my haste to get this done. Okay, so yeah, as Joe alluded to, I've been working with young athletes now, probably going back to 2008, 2009, and been just had my mind in that headspace for some time about how we implement LTAD, and read a lot of the literature and encountered many different environments in which I've had to try and apply that literature with different groups of athletes in different settings. So hopefully I can share some of that experience today. The overview of what I'll talk about, we'll give a quick overview of the pathway in terms of the aims and the sort of where it fits in the big picture of things. And then a bit of a deeper dive into the different phases from foundation development to performance. And then look at some of the stuff that we're doing from an assessment and monitoring perspective. And a lot of this ties into what we're trying to achieve with our aims and helping athletes progress. So an overview of the pathway. I think it's always good to start with what are we trying to achieve. And from my perspective and the organisations that I've worked with, it's primarily about the athletes and trying to help them achieve their goals, their dreams through a holistic and athlete-centred approach. The framework that I've put together with the help of many colleagues as well is a progressive physical development curriculum. And the aim is to transport an athlete from where they join us to an elite level of physical performance. Obviously, we know the kids are developing at different rates, and what we have to try and do is cater for early and late developing athletes, and that's where we'll dive in on some of the assessment and monitoring side and how that informs that part of our process. There's also a key aim for us to ensure that the athletes can tolerate the day-to-day load of training in the environment that they're in and the environment that they will go into at the next stage, and also equipping them with relevant training skills. That often involves conversations with places where we know are likely destinations to get ideas of what they will need to know and be able to do. Away from training, we want them to have appropriate knowledge around psychological, nutrition and lifestyle skills as well. And it is also key for us that we're not just from the beginning of the pathway trying to develop skills for a specific sport. We're developing movement skills and physical abilities that will enable them to live with a lifetime of physical activity, not just perform in a single sport. Okay, so as an overall framework, where I tend to work is between 11 years and upwards. The fundamentals stage for me is something that, as I said here, takes place at home, at school and outdoors, primary school, that being elementary school, depending on where you are in the world. And then through the pathway, there's an evolution from play and creativity to participation and sampling, participation, specialization, and then maximizing performance at the later stages. And my ideas around this model have come from many good sources. Looked at Ian Jeffrey's quadrennial plan for the high school athlete that outlines the foundation, development, performance, and peak phases. Where I work at Aspire, the Qatar Olympic Committee have a Kun Riyadi framework, Kun Riyadi meaning be an athlete in Arabic. They have this, a similar framework to this, fundamentals, development, talent development, performance, excellence. So those lots of models have kind of come together to influence this, as well as the youth physical development model. But a progressive sequence of phases that respect the developmental stage of the athlete in terms of cognitively, emotionally, physically, and then building on the subsequent phases. Obviously, the perfect model doesn't work in every case. We'll have kids join at different stages of the pathway, and maybe that's a discussion point that we can get into in the Q&A at the end in terms of how we handle those things. So going into the phases, so looking at specifically the foundation development performance phases where I operate at Aspire. So we can see a change in the sort of structure that we would give to those sessions from a flexible lesson planning foundation to more structured, slightly more structured monthly templates, but still with room to maneuver as we work towards sort of a more learning objective and outcome curriculum that we would expect to see more in the sort of physical education setting. And then at the performance phase, we've got the really planned and periodized programs. My approach to the sessions with the younger age groups is that I want them to have autonomy. I want them to have some creativity to generate some intrinsic motivation for the activities. And then gradually it becomes a little bit more directed and scripted as we get higher up the pathway. In terms of our key physical qualities, speed, agility, power, fundamental movement skills, this would be how they progress through. So we've got a more gameplay focused aspect of speed, chasing, relays, those sorts of fun games that kids love to play, with a shift to a more technical focus, learning about the correct posture, arm and leg actions for acceleration, transition, maximal velocity running, and then a progressive short to long approach to our speed work when we're in the performance phase. So a similar kind of progression with agility, gameplay, broken down with some closed drill elements to really refine the movement skills before applying them back in gameplay, building to more combined and open patterns. It's not to say that we wouldn't revisit closed drills, but we will have once that closed aspect is really nailed down, we're looking at combining movements in typical combinations that would occur in a wide range of sports with some open and reactive elements. And then at the latter stages, we're really looking at sport and position specific agility, stimuli, scenarios that the athlete might find themselves in regularly that they need to be well equipped for. From a power perspective, we've got progression in our plyometric intensity and ballistic exercises, moving from medicine ball throws to an introduction to Olympic lifting and loaded jumps, and then where we've really got some more where we're applying load in those lifts later on. And from a strength perspective, our work would shift from body weight work primarily at foundation, and then body weight into barbell in development, and then from a performance phase, we'll be really looking to develop relative and maximal strength, and through more advanced, intense and higher intensities of lifting. And then we can just see down the bottom where this sort of integrates with our emphasis of sport, specialization later on. And then just before this, you can see the fundamental movement skills. Really key bit for me in the pathway is that we have gymnastics, parkour, skills track type elements at the foundation phase to address the fundamental movement skills. We retain some of that in development, and then at performance, it's still there, but in very low dose, depending on the engagement that we get from the athletes at that time. So that just summarizes really the progression across all the general progression across those different training modalities. But the key is then, how do we actually apply that in a school setting or an academy setting? So when I was in the UK school, we would give a half term dedicated to a key theme. So term 1, fundamental movements, jumping, landing. Term 2, gymnastics, free running, sports generic movements being agility, acceleration, and maximum velocity. And I say these are the key themes. All of these elements may be present at different times within the year, but it's just what we're emphasizing at that point. A half term would typically be sort of 6 to 8 weeks of work. And then the strength development at the foundation phase is a consistent element to it. So there would be through warm-ups or just small segments of the session that are dedicated to strength development exercises or some basic power development. So how we would maybe get that together in a session plan. So as I said, we try and touch on different things. This would be a phase where strength and power were maybe the priority, but we've still got some speed and agility games at the beginning. Through the course of 6 weeks, we expose them to 6 different games, all with a different target and movement pattern from our agility movement syllabus. And then from a power perspective, we're at the beginning of the year, it's more jumping and landing focus, and we've got bilateral, unilateral exercises as we progress through the 6 weeks. So exposure to a range of different movement skills from an agility perspective, a range of different movement skills from a power perspective, and then really nailing down our basic strength exercises, bilateral deadlift or squat pattern, push, split squat, pull, and some basic core strength. So that would be how maybe a session would break down. The game might be 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes jumping and landing, 20 minutes of strength work, and that's a nice PE lesson type structure that I would use. Quite a quick pace and tempo to keep them engaged, and allow we have a sort of exercise framework where we would allow the kids to be up or down different levels of exercises depending, and allow them to progress at their own rate if they can show good quality of movement. Development year 1 follows a similar kind of theme-based curriculum where we emphasize the different components that we want to see from like the youth physical development model, so speed, agility, strength, power. This is more geared up towards a young track and field group, so we have real emphasis on plyometric progressions within that as a key sort of training modality for us. And then we have progression with our strength exercises. Again, what we're looking at here is the move from foundation is into, we're working now at more relative strength development through the course of that year and the following development year. But we always begin with a back to basics general preparation block where the kids have grown. We're going to look at jumping and landing, keep some low level elastic, LLCs, low leg conditioning work, basic elastic strength development in from the off for these boys. And then we're looking at strength through extended ranges of movement. And you can see the progression again from low loads gradually up to higher percentages of 1 rep max, but we're not going to get up to anything over 80% in this year. Maybe even well within that, depending on the technical competency of the athlete. Then how does that look in a session plan? We start to teach them aspects of individual preparation, and we have expectations on them in this phase that they would be able to conduct a ramp warm-up on their own. As I said, in the previous phase, we'll have elements of different training methods that appear throughout. So plyometric, low amplitude plyometric work in the warm-up. We've got some specific injury prevention exercises for our sprinters, jumpers, and our throwers, depending on where their main sort of focus is at that point in time. We've got some Olympic skill development, and then the real meat and potatoes of our work is done around the relative strength and power development side of things. And then because we know from our injury audits, these are our sort of key areas that we need to hit from an injury prevention perspective for our sprinters and jumpers, the calf, the hamstring, and the hip and the trunk. That's key aspects for us. So we will have elements of that in to make sure that those athletes are robust and can tolerate those elements specifically. From a performance phase, we're then looking at more of a traditional periodized annual plan with the GPP, SPP, and competitive phases. Greater training frequency, and our guys will also at this phase experience international camps and competition exposures. Again, we can just see progression in the training plans. We've now got some loaded ballistic exercises in the form of trap bar jumps or cleans. This is a sort of day 1 and day 2 program. Squats or trap bar deadlifts, benches one day, bench press one day, bench pull another day. So we don't overload the upper body work with our track and field guys so much at this point. And then again, key accessory exercises that are targeted around the calf, hip, and hamstring and core to prepare them. So just some examples there of the progression in the program that outlines it. So on to some assessment and monitoring side of things. I think when we're running a pathway, it's important that we pay attention to some key things. So for me, why do we assess? I know there's lots of people who question doing it with younger athletes. For me, longitudinal tracking of key physical quality is really important, particularly where I am at the moment, where we are somewhere where there is a very small talent pool. We have to try and get the most out of it and identify kids with talent as best we can. And the more data we have, I think the more chance we've got of trying to actually achieve that. So we can monitor our progress towards objectives. If we know the demands of the sport, we can look at how the athletes' capacities are matching to those demands. We can provide feedback and demonstrate progress to key stakeholders, whether that's coaches, athletes themselves, or parents, other organisations that they might be moving to. In the organisations that I work in, being able to provide that is really valued. And then if we can build a big historical database, we can look at establishing some benchmarks and performance trajectories for the different tests and events. So in terms of how that framework fits in, we would test 3 to 4 times a year, September, December, March and June. And I try and have tests that are consistent across the age groups as much as possible, which I'll dive a bit deeper on. Some basics around testing and monitoring. We need to make sure, obviously, what we're using is valid and reliable. We need standardized procedures, standardized warm-ups, collecting data on the same day, consistent collection at time throughout the year, but also at the same times year on year, so we can make direct comparisons at different time points. And if we can, using the same facilities and surfaces. And then report the results quickly to the athletes and the coaches. And I think one thing to really sort of highlight here is, I don't think we should take for granted the reliability of tests that have had reliability and validity papers written about them if the cohort isn't a youth cohort, because of the variability in performance that we can see. It's really important if we're going to test that we know that the tests that we use are valid and reliable with a younger cohort. And then a philosophy I really like from Matt Jordan is it's about identifying what matters, assessing what matters, and changing what matters. And from a youth perspective, one of the big things we know that matters is growth and maturation. So we can have a realistic view on where the athlete is at and what we need to do at that time. But it's also a case of identifying what matters to the sports that we're progressing in, or also those key physical qualities that are identified within the youth physical development model. So can we closely assess those things? So here's a framework that we use at the moment across our foundation development performance phases. You see there's certain things that are really consistent. That's because we want to draw comparisons as much as we can and understand how these physical qualities develop over time. So we have our anthropometric measurements every 3 months. We have some maturation assessments as well. We get wrist x-ray once upon entry to the academy, and then we use the height against the predicted adult height from the x-ray to take a percentage of the predicted adult height and look at the bioband in which they sit. And then we kind of validate that by looking at the growth curves from the same time point the previous year, or we calculate those growth curves manually and look at whether that growth curve matches up with the percentage predicted adult height. So if there's a discrepancy in the predicted adult height, maybe it under or over predicts their maturation status, but the growth curve and saliva testosterone measures are a way that we can be more sure. So we don't put all our eggs in one basket with a single estimation. We look at numerous markers. And then what we've got are our tests that we want to have consistently through our development stage. So we have our strength and power measurements and our speed measurements consistently across the age group, so we can look at this data longitudinally. And for me, this has been one of the really interesting things we've been able to do at Aspire. Can't share too much of that data at the moment, but it's hopefully something we will be able to do soon. But looking longitudinally and having that data with the maturation data is starting to highlight some really interesting things. So looking at the differences we get within age groups, one of the questions I've been asked a number of times, or whenever I talk about these things, is how do you differentiate for different maturity groups, the 3 different maturity groups in your program. And I wanted to highlight this is within an age group, they're actually quite homogeneous. We only have a cut in this. You can see here, this the y-axis is the athlete's height, and then this is where they're in each age group, whether they are pre, circa, or post. So we can see at the under 12 age group, we've got the majority of boys pre-PHV and a couple of boys that are circa. At under 13, most of the boys are circa, and 1 boy is still pre. By under 15s, most of them are now post, and we've got 1 circa And then by under 16, all of them are post-peak height velocity. Now you notice there's no under 14s in the system I was collecting this data in. The under 14s weren't a full-time program at that point, so we have a little gap. But I would imagine if we were looking at this under 14s, that would probably be the age group where we would have to cater to some post, some circa, and some pre, as probably the most variable group. So important that although we could assume everyone was the same, we've got a couple of people in each group that we need to be aware of. Hopefully that visual just kind of highlights the importance of being able to identify that different status. So I alluded to the fact that we're trying to collect data consistently from tests, but also looking at that alongside the maturation assessment really allows us to look at the test data in a different light. And it enables us to more accurately evaluate each athlete's abilities. So what we can see on these graphs, it's a 20-minute sprint test and a counter movement jump test, and the data, each individual test plotted on based on the maturation group. So we can sort of identify the ranges here. Our fastest kids pre-PHV are around 3:25, our slowest out at about 4 seconds. Our fastest by circa PHV is now down under 3 seconds for 20 meters. And these guys dropping under I think it's under 285. So some different ways that we can view that data, and then we can turn that sort of information into then benchmarks around either from the age group or for maturation status. So to highlight how we might use this, if we had a boy, for example, who was an under 13, let's say he's got a counter movement jump of 35 centimeters, but he's also a pre-PHV at the moment, so he's behind the rest of the group probably. So he's got a counter movement jump of 35 centimeters. If we look at him based on his age-based benchmark, he's going to sit between below average and average. So when we're talking to him or he's compared to his group, he doesn't look great. But if we've got the maturation-based benchmarks as well, what we can actually see is that he is actually rated as good. And that can have a big impact in terms of like the motivation of the athlete, or how they maybe view themselves, or how they perceive themselves in terms of their ability. So an important thing for us to do is to try and build these to be able to have these realistic conversations with athletes, coaches, and parents. Away from the actual collection of data and analysis of it, how we visualize and report the data is really important. So for us, something that we've done for our coaches and our athletes is worked at automating the process as much as possible. Been involved in some of the LTADchat Twitter streams, and one of the things I mentioned was the use of Power BI. Power BI is a great tool. You can pull multiple sources together, either from a cloud-based system like Smarterbase or Google Drive, and create live reports for your data sets. And then those can be turned into nice, clean, clear dashboards that can be put out to an iOS device. The data that we collect, we try and have everything ready within 2 to 3 days. If not, some of it's instantaneous because of the API links that we have in place from certain bits of technology. So important that we collect good data, we analyze it, and we share it quickly with the people that matter. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of kind of the system and what we're doing with data and analysis stuff at the moment. So now it's time for some Q&A. Hope I didn't run over too far there, Joe.
No, you're good, James. Again, great overview of a very comprehensive and thorough program that you have. First question, the individual who was asking it said, sorry to ask the question because I saw it on a different slide, but let's just go through this question anyways, because I think it's an important one for everybody to understand, because sometimes we think, we have these models, and no matter what your age is, you just get pigeonholed into a stage. So again, the question is, does everybody start in developmental phase 1, no matter their grade level or age?
Everyone will start with a basic program. If we're like when we start back in September, we'll have some new children to the academy. We'll have some new boys that join in older age groups. They'll all start on a general preparation program. So some basics around core strength, body weight strength exercises. We'll look at them through all of the key movement patterns. And then it's really how they progress in that program will determine on how quickly they move through the phases. What I've typically seen over the years is that if everyone starts on a similar program, similar kind of exercises. For the older boys, if we've got someone who's starting in grade 10, that program will last them 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and they're ready for something else. If that kid is a grade 6 or grade 7 just coming in, that program might be 3 to 4 months for him, because he's just not, he's not mature. He's still maybe a pre-PHV kid. He's going to take time to progress through that. So how long they stay in those basic programs, everyone will start on a basic program that's appropriate to them, and then progress at their own rate. And it's us then judging their technical competency, and obviously looking at what their maturation status is, their training skills, all of those things, injury history, all of that needs analysis type information comes into how they kind of progress and where they begin. But everyone is on some kind of basic program at the start of the year. It's just, as I say, for some, that basic program is like a full-on strength exercise, a full-on strength program for a number of months. And for some of them, it's just general prep, getting back to training, ready to go within 3 or 4 weeks.
Related, and this comes from our good friend Michael Jennings. Are the half-term focal points consistent across all levels of the program? So you had the one slide where you had it divided up into the half terms, and there were, I believe, 6 of them, and you had a focal point, right?
Yeah.
For each of those half terms. Are those consistent across all levels?
The themes are consistent, but the order in which they would appear in would just depend on the facilities that were available at the time, working in a school setting. So in an ideal world, yes, they'd have all run in the same kind of order. But when you were on a school timetable, I'd find certain groups. I was given the gymnasium, for example, and that was really suited to the gymnastics and parkour. So we'll get after that. But with another group, I might not get timetabled on that facility until the summer. So I would try and fit all things in and hit all the objectives within the framework, but I didn't get too hung up on the order at which they occurred. But there were certain things that I would try and do. Let's say, for example, I was given only the S&C gym space, which wasn't very big. Then what I would try and do is I would my primary aims there would be sort of developing, either if it is development phase, it might be the technical competency in the gym on the barbell exercises. If it's the foundation guys, then it's the primary emphasis would be on just that body weight movement competency. But what I would try and do is, one of the things I want to happen at all points of the year is that there's some speed work in there. So if I didn't have a space that was suitable, I would take those guys out of the gym and find any space that I could to do some acceleration work early on and get that speed component in. So that, and obviously get some little bits of plyometric work done as well. So a lot of those things can be done if you're creative with the space. So although acceleration in a lot of it was emphasized later in the year, that was primarily because in the summer I knew I I had good weather, I had open fields. I wasn't competing for spaces on rainy days to do that kind of work. So all things considered, I would adapt it based on facilities, weather, all of those types of things.
Hi, Michael. I see you have your camera on now, and I'm not sure if you have a follow-up to that or not. It seemed like you were kind of dancing around a little bit and may have something else on your mind as well.
I do have something else on my mind, not necessarily to that point though. So
Okay.
I'll let you go about your business, and then I'll try to sneak it in here in a little while.
Yeah, feel free to jump in whenever you think that question fits, okay?
Yep.
James, I have a question sort of related to that last response. And you're at a place right now where you deal largely with specialized athletes, track and field.
Yeah.
You obviously have been in settings where you've had to deal with multi-sport athletes. So what kind of adjustments do you make to the programming with a multi-sport athlete?
Versus a specialized athlete?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the way I tried to address that at St. Peter's was just to make sure that that's why that curriculum was so broad. It was, let's cover down the bottom all the movement patterns that we can from a agility perspective. Let's cover all the basic strength exercises. Let's cover the linear speed work. So very general and not too specific, developing all those qualities that we see highlighted in the research. And then later, the other thing being that a lot of those you'd have athletes from all different sports that would come within the school program. So we had to kind of settle on a more generic program to keep everybody happy. Because if we were just running a sole just for football, we'd have lost people. You know, there'd be people who weren't interested or didn't feel like it was relevant to them. But at the same time, I would differentiate lessons and activities with, so I had mixed groups, boys and girls sometimes, so I would have elements of the program that would be more relevant to the sports the girls were playing at that time of year, and then I would have elements that the boys were more relevant to. Let's say they were playing rugby and the girls were playing hockey. We would have elements of that, things that were relevant in order for them to be able to, I guess, relate to the content that we were delivering. Yeah, does that answer it, or you need me to?
No, I think that's good. That's good. I'm going to move forward to testing. There's a couple of questions related to testing. One is, I think, pretty straightforward here from Michael Jennings again on 1RM testing.
Yeah.
In year one of the developmental phase. And then the second question, I think, is going to be a much longer response. So let's start with testing 1RM in year one development phase.
No, we don't test it. We don't.
And
we just,
do you want to expand on that and maybe rationale why?
I just don't. One, in a large group environment, I just don't think we can do it safely in terms of all eyes on, and I don't think it's necessary at that point. Those what RM percentages that I used are more sort of, we would work off training like 10 RMs, 8 RMs, how close the athlete thought that they were to those, keep reps in reserve, that kind of thing. Just not something that I'm interested in doing with a development one athlete. The emphasis really there is more on the technical side. That outline on that framework is more for coaches to say, we aren't going anywhere near 95% of a 1RM with these athletes. I think you can go to 70 to 80% quite comfortably. particularly with some of the more mature kids in that age group. But there just isn't any need to go into those higher percentages at that point. I don't think. And I actually feel like a lot of the training stimulus, if you've got a rounded program, is going to come from your speed and your plyometric work. That's where you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck. The strength work there is to support it, keep them robust, get them, gradually get them stronger. But it's a slow cook approach with that strength work. I think I've been guilty in the past of maybe going a bit too intense too soon, and I don't think the long-term benefits I don't think there are many long-term benefits to getting there too early.
Next question on testing comes from Jonathan Griffin. Two-part question here, so I think we're going to have to definitely take a little time for number one and then for number two. So first part, how does your day-to-day training, data collection, drive the program relative to your dedicated testing days?
Okay, so our day-to-day training data, in terms of we use a system called Visual Coaching Pro for our weight room work, and we'll record weights, reps completed, sets completed, and that, to be honest, has probably more influence on what we do in the weight room than our testing, our dedicated testing days do. I kind of view at the younger ages those dedicated testing days as like seeing where they're at, seeing what areas we need to develop, and then our interventions that we make in the weight room, we would obviously hope to see the numbers going up in the direction that we want. So we might see, but I'd say the dedicated testing days have more influence when we're working with the older athletes than the younger athletes. It's almost, then we can, mostly those numbers in the dedicated testing days are going to continue to go up with our younger boys, with the fact that they're growing and maturing. And yeah, I think that the day-to-day data is what drives our training decisions. We're looking at how competent they are with the movements. We don't collect a huge amount of data due to the size of our groups in terms of like training load data. It's quite difficult when we've got 4 or 5 different events going on in a training session. So it's not like football where we can track GPS. A lot of the time we've got groups of athletes in different places. So the easiest example is the one I gave you with the weight room. In terms of the benefits to dedicated testing days, for us, I think we're in a sport, track and field, which doesn't have a lot of research in terms of the youth space. Yeah, has limited research on elite level athletes. So for us, one of the things we've been trying to do is to really build a solid data set for us to understand what do, for want of a better word, elite youth track and field athletes look like as they are developing, because they are a different breed. So the benefits for us are, a lot of it is about building that testing database and then being able to identify levels of strength, power and speed that differentiate probably the competitive level that those boys can get to. And there appears to be some pretty clear thresholds in things like relative power and stiffness, reactive strength qualities for certain events. And we're trying to understand also the relationships between those key physical metrics that we're taking and the actual outcome of the event. So how much of the variance in performance in a long jump can we attribute to reactive strength, relative power, maximal velocity, and we're starting to get closer to answer those things now. But when I arrived, we didn't. So those are the kind of things that I see as the major benefits. But we do, as much as possible, try and embed our tests into the training sessions, and this is driven by the coaches as much as anything, because if we're taking them away from coaching and training time, it creates big problems with the coaches. So as an example, part of our testing battery for our 10-5 rebound jump on isometric leg press is all done at the start of an S&C session. So the boys come down, standardized warm-up, 10-5 rebound jump, isometric leg press, get into the gym program. Our power and speed testing day is done on a Monday morning. They do CMJ, standing long jump, and 350-meter sprints. And the coaches view it very much as a track session, and they'll use it as a speed stimulus for that week. And likewise, at the back end of the week, we'll do a 150-meter time trial, and again, they use that as their speed endurance session. So we are very much viewing it as training is testing, testing is training, but trying to put that scientific rigor to it as well, with some tighter testing protocols around those that we use as well. There are some field testing batteries as well. We look at them, but we need to be a little bit clearer on how reliable and consistent that data is. And I think because there's more skill to it, a bit like you've alluded to in the past, Joe, we actually need to make sure that we've got a technical assessment alongside some of those things like the overhead back med ball throws, between leg forward med ball throws, so we can see that there is, it's either a technical improvement or is it a physical change in the athlete's strength and power qualities. So I went on a bit then, so I might have.
I knew that that question was going to prompt quite a bit of thought and discussion there. So thanks for your response on that one, Jonathan. I hope that was suffice. Michael, do you have a quick question before I have one wrap-up question? So I know that you have a pressing question to ask here. So
yeah, and it's
go ahead and jump in.
Thank you, Joe. And it is about the assessment piece. More specifically, when you are breaking down your results and you had those benchmarks that you've created, James, and you've broken them down even further from age to pre-PHV, post-PHV, and circa PHV. That educational piece for the athletes, is that taking place in your sessions, or is that taking place outside of your sessions in a different venue? Because I feel like that could take a little bit of time to really get the athletes to grasp what's going on, because you said that you like to share, obviously, the results with stakeholders. How do you convey that information?
When I was in the UK, it was a little bit easier because we didn't have the Arabic language barrier. So we would, how we would tend to do that is I would tend to introduce that concept at an open event at the beginning of the year for parents to attend. And we would talk about growth and maturation. We would talk about that as part of the process and understanding that there are early and late developers. And then what I would do is usually in the first term, we would have a parents' evening, where it's a one-to-one sit down with me, the parents, and the child. And I would explain where they are at and what that means to them in a one-to-one scenario. I don't get that opportunity here at Aspire, but I try to have those conversations in the coaching environment, particularly if I notice, like we had a situation the other night, we were doing some competitive sprints. One of the boys was getting a little bit sort of dejected because a younger lad had got the better of him in the first 20-meter sprint, and it was actually the coach that sort of relayed that information to him, like, look, he's a bit more mature. If you look, he's got that muscle, he's got that frame. So yeah, in our environment now, it's a little bit more difficult to have those conversations, but just even getting the coaches here on board with that, it's been an education for them as well. And I think we've still got a better job to do with that here. But as I said, the example of how I would handle it before, I think is the best way, when you can actually sit down with a parent and their child and say, this is where you are and this is what it means. You know, at the moment, you're not going to be as strong and powerful. But if you look at this information in terms of those benchmarks, you are actually doing really well. This isn't a level playing field right now. Those kind of conversations have always worked quite well. Trying to keep things as simple as possible, obviously.
James, one more question. This comes from Ryan Elizaga. Ryan, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. But Ryan is a high school strength coach who is not part of a teaching staff. Yeah. And he is in a country that's relatively new to LTAD, including growth and maturation. So you know I love this question right here, right? How can I best present these ideas to the school's academic supervisor and coordinators? How can he get them to buy into this and then begin the implementation process?
Tough one. I'm trying to think.
You've done it before though, right? When you were at St. Peter's,
you
went down this road. So
it was external. I think you've got to find a way to get that, make that concept known. And a lot of it they will see. So I think it started, some conversations around it for us happened with, we had a really clear example of a late developer who all of a sudden started to progress, and the coaches were raving about him and the work that we've done, and it was kind of like, well, look, you know, this is what's happening with this guy. He's the later developer. He's now really starting to show what he can do. So live examples always help. But just, I think, having conversations with the key member in the department, asking them what they know about this process already, so they don't feel like you're trying to teach them to suck eggs, and it's a slow and steady kind of like, well, this is kind of, you know, how we can monitor it and what it means. We had conversations early on about trying to do sort of bio-banded fixtures and things like that, which just didn't really become a reality in our school environment back home, but it enabled those conversations to start happening. But it is really those conversations. At Aspire, what I've tried to do is just do some short education sessions when I first arrived about, you know, how we were going to use that growth and maturation data, or how we could use it, what the benefits are of using it, but trying not to sort of overload them with information and numbers and figures to begin with. Picking out some examples of kids that are there. But it is a little bit tougher when you're an external coach and not on the teaching staff. I often found it was more to do with the fact that the teachers didn't have a lot of time to sit down and talk to me about these type of things. They were running from one class to another. So maybe it's something to try and tie in with the in-service training day or whatever CPD opportunities you get in the year with the PE staff, sending them the odd article. Maybe Joe Eisenman's blog's a great place to start with that as well. It can be tricky. I've worked with some older coaches in the last few years who were quite dismissive of the information, but I would say, you know, if you're in control of that program, collect the data, and eventually if you have that information that you can relay and share, there will be people who will find value in it. And even if they don't get it in the beginning, when they start to see that data and things happening that, whether it's you're saying, oh, this kid is coming into the growth spurt, and then within the next 6 months, this kid shoots up 6 or 7 centimeters. And they think you're some kind of magician, but it can win them over. So that I would encourage you, even if they're not on board with it, gathering that data and being able to have those conversations about certain boys or girls, whatever in the program, I think you're then people will start to see the value in it.
Good. James, one more question. Elliot is asking a question going back to assessment here. And
Yeah.
Elliot, if I don't make this clear, please feel free to unmute yourself as well. So
Yeah.
Elliot thinks he's going to have trouble getting buy-in from the family related to what he's saying, quote unquote, lab testing.
Yeah.
Feeling like there'd be some pushback, whether it be expense, privacy, or burden. So any advice there? Or yeah, Elliot, if you want to rephrase that or, ask it differently, feel free to.
All right. No, that's exactly. I mean, I feel like sometimes, when I have, I don't say elite athletes, but the better athletes, I think they're, or the parents that push, they get it. I have some who look like, who seem to be very talented, who have the talent. You can tell they have the raw talent. The parents have a hard time buying in, even to the strength and conditioning side of things. They want to send their kids to their soccer practice, their basketball practice, and get their private soccer, call them tutors, whatever, trainers and soccer and basketball trainers and football trainers and all that. But when it comes to this part, a lot of them don't understand the buy-in. So adding another layer to that, like not only am I going to, train them in this way, but now I want to get them tested. And our medical system doesn't always set up for that. So they always want everything insurance-based, right? And getting tested for this isn't. So I don't know, if you had that experience at all with pushback in that sense.
I've never had a lot of pushback with it, but we've always tried to explain the rationale behind the tests of what we're doing, and I've always tried to get it down to the least number of tests that I would need to do, and to those that really matter most to performance in the long term. So as I said, alluded to, like looking at finding the metrics that matter for our track and field athletes as an example, or knowing, using the research. Worked with some tennis players who I'd probably say were the closest population to what you're describing. Overemphasis on the technical side, underemphasis on the physical preparation side. But when we presented information to them to say, right, well, this is the VO2 max of an elite tennis player, which equates to level whatever it was on the bleep test. At the moment, we don't. Where are you at? Where, if they've done one at school, maybe you get the level off them, and then you make a comparison and say, look, we want to be really specific about, making progress for your son or daughter to be able to meet the demands of the game at the highest level. We need to know where they're at currently in these key areas. So that's always how I've approached it, is try to outline whether it's the strength, the power, the speed, the aerobic endurance, whatever it is, what are the levels that are required at either the next level or the elite level, based on information that I gather from other practitioners that are usually willing to share. And then if they're not willing to test, they're not willing to test, but then it's always that case of it's informed consent. They are deciding they can pull out when they want to in that test. So for me, that's kind of the way that I've approached it, and more often than not, the parents have said, like, okay, yeah, we want to know where little Johnny's at in his whether it's a maximum aerobic speed test or multi-stage fitness test or 30-15 or whatever it is. they've generally come around to it when they've seen that there's a clear rationale.
Thanks.
No problem.
Good. Yeah, we're at the top of the hour here. We're going to close up. James, thanks again for sharing your model and your experience. Listeners can learn more about your work and many others who have begun participating in this worldwide community on the Child to Champion platform at proformance.pro/LTAD-hub. So stay tuned for future LTAD Chat Live episodes, as we'll continue to do this about 1 or 2 times per month here on LTAD Chat Live. And we're also going to be adding to our library with LTAD Shorts and the monthly LTAD Twitter chats as well. Again, all the episodes can be found on the LTAD Chat YouTube channel. That's a wrap for today, everybody. Thanks for joining. James, thanks again for taking the time to share the model and your experience.
No problem. Thanks for the invitation.
It was excellent. Outstanding, James.
Cheers, guys.